Hello, crafty friends! It's Alicia here with a project for Tailored Expressions. In today's video, I'm going to be using products from the new Scattered Blooms card making kit to create a fun foiled floating florals card. From the new kit, I'll be using Scattered Blooms Layering Stencil and cutting plate, along with the Big Hugs die and one of the cards from the Insider's Scattered Blooms, and this one reads, "Hope you're feeling back in full bloom very soon." From the a la carte items, I'll be using the Foil It Scattered Blooms as well as the Big Hugs backer die. For cardstock, I'll be using Dill, Pickle, Oyster, and Sugar Cube, and for the ink blending, I got out Dill Pickle, Oyster, Bubblegum, Candy Corn, and Confetti Cake. For foiling, I will be using Silver Stars and Sparkle Fun Foil and the Foil Magic Shim for some nice consistent foiling. I also grabbed the TE sticky sheets, and I'm going to show you how to use those to foil the die cut sentiment, and I will be showing you how you can use it with some of the leftover foil. To help with the floating elements, I got out TE masking paper and their stick and stamp mat. I'll be doing some die cutting with the Arch Stacklets and the A2 postage stamp stacklets. I'll be adding some extra texture with the Knock on Wood background stamp, and to help me get a nice impression, I got out the exclusive TE Teal Misty and the Just Press tool. And I will be using a variety of adhesives to hold everything together. Let's get crafty! I'm going to get started with the stamping, and for this I'll be using a tone-on-tone look, so I cut a piece of oyster to 4 by 5 1/4, and I will be inking up that Knock on Wood background stamp with oyster ink. To hold my cardstock in place, you'll see I added a little bit of adhesive to the back and place that in the center of my Misty. Then I lay my Knock on Wood background stamp face down on top of that, ink it up, and stamp it. I did use the Just Press tool to help with the impression, and it turned out great the first time. Next, I'll be adding some sparkle to the Foil It panel. I cut a piece of the Stars and Sparkle foil that I knew would cover the printed area on the piece, and then I'm going to put that on top of the Foil Magic Shim and slip it into the carrier sheet. I ran that through my mini mink, let it cool down, and then once I pulled off that foil, look at that sparkle. There is quite a bit of leftover foil, so once again I will be showing you later how you can use some of that up. Now it's time to add color to the foiled piece with those coordinating stencils. The great thing about these is each of the 5 stencils have little squares on them that line up with the pre-printed squares on the Foil It panel. So I added some adhesive to the back of the foiled piece, got that placed onto the grid paper, and then I used some Post-it tape to hold down my stencils while I added the color. When I am ink blending, I try to start with a light hand and use clockwise and counterclockwise motions. After I switch a stencil out, I use the squares once again to start the lineup for the second one. Now sometimes you might need to wiggle it just a little bit, see what looks good to you. I continued with the other 4 colors since there are 5 total stencils for this, switching out and readjusting each stencil when needed. Now this card that I'm creating today, while I am using the Foil It panels, you could definitely just stencil these onto the Sugar Cube cardstock and cut with the coordinating dies. Once I had my 5th color down, which was the Oyster Flower Centers, it was time for the reveal. And I know I always say it, but this is definitely my favorite part of stenciling. After this piece dried for about 5 minutes, I brought in a soft cloth to wipe in any ink that was sitting on top of the foiled areas. Then I brought in the coordinating die, which just like the stencils, has some alignment guides that line up with those pre-printed squares on the stencil and the foiled piece. I lined those up, took it off camera to die cut it, and then I took a couple minutes to punch out all of those little flowers. While I was in die cutting mode, I decided to work on the sentiment. For this, I'm using the Big Hugs and the Big Hugs backer. For the backer, it will just go right onto that scrap of sugar cube cardstock, but for the word itself, I cut out a scrap of the sticky sheet and placed that on the front of the sugar cube cardstock. Now I'm going to tape down both of the dies right to the front of that. Now, when I bring those back in, I have that sugar cube backer, and my Hugs die, it has sticky on the front of it. The release paper pulled right off with the die, so I just had to remove the die cut itself and the little centers of like the G and the H and the S. Once that was done, I brought in that scrap of foil that I had used previously, and I burnished that across the front of the Hugs word with my fingers. I removed that very carefully so I didn't tear the word, and then I filled in any of the areas that didn't have foil by just pressing it in those places and reburnishing. Because the foil itself already looks kind of speckled, it doesn't really make a difference in the end, and now I have a shiny sentiment for my card. To adhere these two pieces together, I held the word with my reverse tweezers and then used liquid glue to add to the back. Then I carefully place this, trying to get an even border around the word on that backer. Because it's liquid glue, you do have a little bit of wiggle time. While that dried, I worked on the flowers. For this, I went ahead and separated all of the flowers and leaves by type and size. To each of the kind of larger flowers, everything but those little blues, I'm going to add one leaf. I do this by putting a dot of glue on the tip of the leaf and then placing a flower on top of it. I finished most of these off camera, and once they had dried, I ended up with some leftover leaves, and I'm going to hang on to those to fill up spaces later in the floating area. Speaking of floating area, it is now time to work on that. I am going to be using the stick and stamp mat, which is low tack, and later I will be cutting it with the third from largest Arch Stacklet. So I'm going to bring that in now so I have an idea of what area I need to fill. The pre-printed lines on the mat are also going to come in handy. Now for my floating area, I do want my sentiment to be included in that. So I kind of put that down to make sure that I could get some flowers underneath it and on top of it. Now what I'm going to do is bring in the flowers that I put together, starting with kind of the larger ones, and I want to fill the area. Now I have seen this done before by other crafters, and I've been wanting to try it for a while. They would put their pieces face down because they only used one low tack area, but I wanted to be able to see the colors that I was placing next to each other a little better. So that is why I'm using the stick and stamp mat, and then in a little bit you'll see me use the TE masking paper. I spent some time filling up that area, and then once I thought I had it done, here is a look at that completed. Now if you want to pause the video here to replicate the spacing and the flowers, you could do that. The TE masking paper comes in sheets of 5 by 7, and if you cut this in half at 3.5 by 5, it is almost perfect for that third from largest stacklet. So here I have a half sheet. I'm going to remove the release paper from one side and then place that down carefully over the flowers on the stick and stamp mat. Then, to help remove the flowers from the mat, I kind of bend it in half and then carefully pull back that masking paper. Now you'll see a couple flowers did stay behind. That's okay, I'm just going to remove them and try to put them back in place on the masking paper. Now in person it's a little bit easier to see, but I can see through this now so that when I go to place down the die on the masking paper, I know where to place it. To hold it in place, I'm going to be using some removable tape, and before I run that through my die cut machine, I removed the Hugs word. While I was off camera die cutting this, I used the A2 postage stamp stacklet to cut my stamped oyster piece down as well. Now it's time to make those flowers float. But before I can do that, I did take a minute to put the Hugs die back in place, and then I brought in some TE sticky strips and some of their foam tape. I used a combination of these two adhesives to make sure that everything would be popped up. Now this was probably the most fussy part of the card, but it is totally worth it. Once I had the foam on back of everything, there was a very small piece that was too little for foam, so I removed that and I replaced it with one of the little leaves that I had left over. Then I removed all of the release tape from the back and brought in my card base, which I had added that wood grain stamped oyster piece to. Now what I'm going to do is turn my arch over and carefully put that in place. When I have it nice and centered, I press it down firmly and then start peeling back the masking paper. This is one place where you'll want to go slow so you don't tear anything. But once you've removed it, you now have all of these fun floating elements. Let me know in the comment section below if you've ever tried this technique. I filled in some of the open areas with silver drip drops, and while those are drying, I wanted to give you a bonus tip. And that is how you can use up some of that remaining foil. I cut a piece of sugar cube to 4 by 5 1/4, and now I'm going to cut 4 strips of a TE sticky sheet into 3/4 of an inch wide. Now I'm going to remove one side of the backing paper on that, and I'm going to make a frame around the outside edge of that sugar cube piece. You'll want to trim off the excess areas or the excess ends as you go along, and once it's covered, you're going to burnish the paper and then remove the other side of the sticky sheet. Now bring back in that foil and just rubbing it with your fingers, go ahead and foil the sticky border. Now you have a shiny piece of cardstock that you can use on a future project as a mat. And once again, because it's kind of that speckled foil, it doesn't have to look perfect. Once the drip drops had dried, I added one of the leftover flower pieces to the foiled insider card, and then I got this adhered on the inside. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. If you enjoyed the process, a thumbs up is appreciated. And if you're not already a subscriber, we do hope you'll click on the button below so you're the first to know about our latest videos. To find out more about the products I used today, you can check out the links in the description box below or visit the Tailored Expressions online store at tailoredexpressions.com.